Subcommittee will come to order. I know that Mr. Deutsch is right in the side room, so he'll be right out, and my apologies for starting late. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record. Apologies for keeping you waiting. And members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I'd first like to thank all of the individuals and organizations involved in providing humanitarian assistance for the Syrian crisis. Working in an active conflict zone is incredibly dangerous, but also desperately needed. So we thank you and we support you. Today's hearing in the subcommittee's fourth hearing that focuses specifically on the Syrian humanitarian crisis. It has been an issue we have been following closely since the fighting in Syria began over 5 years ago, and until the administration gets serious about developing a comprehensive plan to end the conflict, it will unfortunately be an issue we will continue to revisit. The numbers are truly staggering. By most estimates, there have been at least 250,000 Syrians killed, and possibly as much as nearly 500,000. Nearly 5 million Syrians have fled to neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. There are nearly 7 million internally displaced Syrians, and more than 13.5 million people are in need of assistance, with about 5.5 million people in besieged and hard-to-reach areas. We've convened this hearing today to see how we can maximize our efforts and limit risks when providing humanitarian assistance. In addition to the $5 billion already provided, Secretary Kerry announced earlier this week $439 million in additional humanitarian assistance, and the President's budget request for fiscal year 2017 seeks nearly $2.1 billion through accounts that addresses the humanitarian impact of this crisis. This is a lot to ask of the U.S. taxpayer, especially when we know that there is no end in sight to this terrible crisis. And that is why Congress must conduct oversight to ensure that this assistance is being used as effectively and efficiently as possible. And that's why I was pleased to be joined by Ranking Member Deutsch, Jerry Connolly, and Ron DeSantis in requesting a GAO review of our Syrian humanitarian assistance program. This report focuses solely on our programs inside Syria. While with the U.S. no longer having a presence in the country, we have to rely on remote programs and coordinating with implementing partners. We recognize this brings challenges, but these challenges also make it more important for our agencies to mitigate all risks, because situations like these make our efforts more vulnerable to waste, fraud, abuse, and diversion. And that is precisely what GAO and USAID's Inspector General have found, that we have weaknesses in our humanitarian aid programs in Syria, and both state and USAID could improve their fraud oversight. GAO's review found that most of the implementing partners that we work with to provide humanitarian assistance into Syria do not assess the risk of fraud. Why is this important? Well, we will hear from the Inspector General that her office has opened 25 cases to investigate allegations of abuse of USAID funds with 3 common fraud schemes. This obviously raises concerns not only with how USAID and state oversee our assistance programs, but it raises concerns regarding the checks and balances our implementing partners have in place as well. We rely heavily on our partners, as does the UN, where 75% of all of our assistance is funneled through. And if they are lax in their oversight, we run the risk of wider loss due to waste, fraud, and abuse and diversion. What GAO also found is that not only do most implementing partners not assess the risk of fraud, but their controls for mitigating the risk of fraud and loss were not informed by a risk assessment. So it's likely that they either don't know what they are looking for or looking in the wrong place. And that is why GAO has recommended that USAID and states strengthen their fraud oversight themselves. but they must also require implementing partners to conduct fraud assessment and to ensure monitors are properly trained. These are common sense recommendations for our efforts in Syria, but they're also common sense for state and USAID across the board. We provide large sums of money and assistance every year and administer very large programs. We need to be doing everything we can to minimize the risk of waste, fraud, abuse, and diversion. It is also important because we do send most of our assistance through the UN, and from there, we have less oversight, less transparency. If we can work with our implementing partners to strengthen how they assess the risk of fraud and how they improve their oversight, we have a better chance of maximizing the humanitarian assistance response across the board. State and USAID are doing a good job with its humanitarian response, but we can always seek to do better. We all want to ensure that we're being proper stewards of the American taxpayer dollars, but we're also promoting our core ideals and values as Americans by doing what we can to help those suffering from the ongoing crisis in Syria. So I'm eager to hear from our witnesses on how we can accomplish both of these objectives without sacrificing our ability to assist those in dire need. And with that, I apologize to our ranking member for my lateness, and he is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It was an honor to arrive before you.
Thank you.
Once. It's the first time ever. Thanks so much for holding today's hearing, and thanks for your continued commitment to making sure that this committee keeps the humanitarian response to the Syrian crisis at the forefront of our work. And thank you to Congressman Connolly and Congressman DeSantis for joining us in requesting the GAO report to review our humanitarian assistance to Syria. Because of the extensive U.S. commitment to responding to this humanitarian crisis, this report is not only very timely, but it's extremely important for the safety and for the accountability of our aid programs. I also thank our witnesses for appearing here today and for the work that you do to ensure proper oversight of aid to the Syrian people who are in critical need. The humanitarian crisis in Syria has reached staggering heights. I repeat these figures at every hearing because we have to take a moment to just try to grasp the magnitude of the crisis. There are now more than 13.5 million people inside Syria in need of immediate humanitarian assistance. 13.5 million people, of which 6.5 million are internally displaced. These people require health care, water and sanitation, shelter, food, and all of them desperately need protection. Since the crisis began in 2011, Syria's development situation has regressed almost by 4 decades, and the life expectancy among Syrians has dropped more than 20 years. This humanitarian catastrophe is exacerbated further by the Assad regime, which has intentionally obstructed access to the Syrian people. The regime leverages food and water as a weapon of war. The regime's systematic denial of medical assistance, food supplies, and other humanitarian aid to people living in besieged areas is unacceptable. It is illegal under international law. There are over 5 million people in hard-to-reach areas, including close to 600,000 people in 18 besieged areas who are dying from starvation. This flagrant violation of international humanitarian norms must end. The number of deaths surpasses 400,000 Syrians, and this number increases every day. These are not just numbers, they are human lives, and we must continue to think of that. I commend the hundreds of aid workers, NGOs, and implementing partners that are on the ground, risking their lives to provide food and medical care to the Syrian people. You, are doing an exceptional job in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, and I don't think that you get the credit that you deserve. I'm proud that the United States has stepped up to lead the worldwide humanitarian response effort. The U.S. has consistently led global funding efforts since 2013, and our total funding has passed $5 billion at the end of this year. Other donor countries must now fulfill their pledges, something that we say at every one of these hearings, and it continues to be true and urgent. Yet the scale of the need continues to grow. I understand that a humanitarian response of this size is not easy, especially in an operating environment that is particularly dangerous and hostile. Delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance inside Syria is further complicated by our reliance on partners who can deliver cross-border aid. This means USAID and other international NGOs have been forced to oversee assistance remotely from neighboring countries, including Turkey and Jordan. USAID has relied on implementing partners to cross the border into Syria to deliver assistance into both government and opposition-controlled areas. These cross-border operations only increase the opportunity for risks and fraud and for other entities and individuals to take advantage of our resources. And this is troubling. When I hear about organized criminal networks infiltrating aid organizations, or instances of bribery, bid rigging, delivery of products of lower quality, or even the failure of delivery altogether, I'm concerned about where the gaps exist within our humanitarian assistance programs. I'm concerned whether these programs have adequately assessed the risks and provided the necessary oversight of the programs and their partners. Our aid agency and partners need to be prepared for potential risks and fraud, especially in a context like this. They need to consistently review and verify that they're meeting financial obligations and holding the highest standards for aid products and partners. The GAO found that although USAID had guidelines for verifying the progress of activities in Syria, they did not include clear instructions to identify and recognize potential fraud risks. Moreover, field monitors did not receive fraud awareness training. When internal controls, monitoring, and financial oversight plans fail, it puts taxpayer dollars at risk, but more importantly, it delays the critical and crucial assistance to those who are depending on this aid. It diverts resources from those who need it most. We need to keep our agencies and partners accountable. The Syrian people deserve that, and I am pleased to see that USAID has concurred and is in the process of implementing all of the GAO recommendations. I'm also pleased that USAID has increased its own third-party monitoring of programs. It is a war zone out there. We understand there will be unforeseen circumstances and challenges. There will, unfortunately, always be situations where individuals will attempt to take advantage of the chaos. Despite all of these challenges, we need to have that confidence that the agencies are doing all they possibly can to mitigate fraud and mismanagement of our resources. We need to have the confidence that the agencies have made all the necessary risk assessments and are continually monitoring and updating procedures to close the gaps and vulnerabilities. I applaud USAID for working so quickly to address these gaps, and I'm hopeful that the measures that USAID has put in place as a result of both the GAO and OIG's work will give us that confidence. All of that is to say that while there are many obstacles to assisting Syrians, we are helping millions and we are saving many, many lives. Americans can be proud that we are the largest donor country to the Syrian crisis, that we are the largest donor worldwide to humanitarian assistance. We are committed to living up to our values and to meeting the needs of the millions in crisis. I look to our witnesses today to help us better understand the situation on the ground and to their recommendations. And Madam Chairman, before I yield back, I would take just a moment, personal privilege if I may. Julie Ahn, who is sitting behind me, is a Rangel Fellow from the State Department who is completing her internship with us before she heads off to the Kennedy School in the fall. She will then be entering the Foreign Service to pursue the good work that our Foreign Service officers do all around the world.
Yay.
So
After 2 lovely years in Kurdistan.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I thank you very much, and I appreciate your
Thank
giving me that
you.
opportunity.
So safe speed, and may it all go well. And now I'd like to turn for any opening statements that they would like to make to Randy Weber of Texas, and then to be followed by Ron DeSantis of Florida.
I'm good. I'm ready to go. Thank you.
Texans are always ready. Ron?
Let's get this show on the road.
Let's do it. Well, thank you, and I know Lee Zeldin is there on the side, and if he comes back, we'll recognize him. But the subcommittee is delighted to welcome back Dr. Thomas Melito, who serves as the Director of the International Affairs and Trade Team at the Government Accountability Office, GAO. In this capacity, Dr. Melito is primarily responsible for GAO's multilateral assistance portfolio, as well as other areas of important oversight. So welcome back. And next, we would like to welcome to our subcommittee for the first time, but we know that it's going to be a repeated engagement, Ms. Ann Calvaresi-Barr, who serves as the Inspector General for the United States Agency of International Development, USAID. In this capacity, She leads the USAID Office of Inspector General, exercising broad oversight authority over programs and operations of USAID, as well as the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the U.S. African Development Foundation, the Inter-American Foundation, and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. They sure keep you busy. So it's my understanding that the two of you came through GAO at the same time, so this is a very public reunion of sorts. Welcome, both of you. And we'll start with Dr. Melito.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here to discuss the work you requested on the delivery of U.S. humanitarian
If you could bring that microphone a little bit closer.
I am pleased to be here to discuss the work you requested on the delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance to people inside Syria. The conflict in Syria has created a complex humanitarian challenge. As of May 2016, the UN reported that 13.5 million people inside Syria have been affected by the conflict and are in need of humanitarian assistance, such as food, shelter, and medicine. Since the start of the conflict in March 2011, the United States, through the Department of State and USAID, has provided over $5 billion in humanitarian assistance, about half of which has been provided for assistance to people inside Syria. In 2015, the U.S. provided more than a quarter of the total international funding for the humanitarian response to Syria. My testimony summarizes our report on the delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance to people inside Syria, which is being released today. I will focus on 4 topics. First, factors affecting delivery of assistance. Second, the extent to which state, USAID, and their partners have assessed risks to their program. Third, implementation of controls to mitigate identified risks and ensure appropriate financial oversight of humanitarian assistance projects. And fourth, GAO's recommendations and the agency responses. Regarding the first topic, several factors complicate the delivery of humanitarian assistance to people inside Syria. For example, the increasingly violent and widespread Syrian conflict has hindered effective delivery of humanitarian assistance. In addition, administrative procedures put in place by the Syrian government have delayed or limited the delivery of humanitarian assistance, especially to besieged areas. Further, due to restrictions for traveling to Syria, state and USAID staff must manage the delivery of humanitarian assistance remotely from neighboring countries. Regarding the second topic on risk assessments, U.S. agencies do not require comprehensive risk assessments from implementing partners, and most partners have not assessed the risk of fraud. Risk assessment involves comprehensively identifying risks associated with achieving program objectives and determining actions to mitigate those risks. In the context of Syria, such risks include theft, fraud, and safety and security. Most of the implementing partners we examined conducted formal risk assessments for at least one type of risk, most commonly security risk. In addition, several maintain assessments on a variety of risks that are updated on a regular basis. However, few of these implementing partners conducted risk assessments for the risk of fraud, despite elevated risk for fraud in assistance projects inside Syria. These risks have been highlighted through the ongoing and closed fraud investigations by USAID's Inspector General. Absent assessments of fraud risk, implementing partners may not have all the information needed to design appropriate controls to mitigate such risk. In addition, state and USAID officials may not have sufficient awareness of the risk of fraud or loss due to theft. Regarding the third topic on oversight, partners have implemented controls to mitigate some of the risks of delivering humanitarian assistance inside Syria, but U.S. agencies could improve their oversight of these programs. We found that partners we examined had implemented controls to mitigate certain risks of delivering humanitarian assistance inside Syria. For example, many partners implemented controls to account for safety and security risks to their personnel and beneficiaries receiving assistance. However, we found that fraud oversight could be strengthened. While USAID hired a contractor for verifying the progress of activities in Syria, they have not clearly instructed field monitors on how to identify and collect information on potential fraud risks. Further, The contractors have not received fraud awareness training. Regarding the fourth topic, GAO made several recommendations in our report. To provide more complete information to assist the agencies in conducting oversight activities, state and USAID should require the implementing partners to conduct fraud risk assessments. In addition, USAID should ensure its field monitors are trained to identify potential fraud risks and collect information on them. Both agencies agreed with GAO's recommendations. Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my prepared statement. I will be pleased to respond to any questions you may have at this time.
Thank you very much. Ms. Calvaresi.
Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to discuss USAID's efforts to provide humanitarian assistance to the more than 13 million in Syria affected by the crisis there. The billions of dollars USAID has invested not only provide relief to those impacted, it strengthens our standing in the world. Yet, despite our goodwill, bad characters have taken advantage of the complex situation for personal gain, ultimately denying Syrian people the food, clothing, health care, and other aid they urgently need. Today, I will summarize the actions our special agents and investigators have taken to uncover and stop fraud. I will also highlight several program management concerns exposed by these investigations. When the U.S. designated the response to Syria as a contingency operation, we ramped up our oversight in the region. OIG investigators briefed hundreds of USAID and implementer staff on fraud indicators and developed a comprehensive handbook for how to identify and report fraud. They also stood up the Syria Investigations Working Group to share information with other U.S. and international oversight organizations about ongoing investigative issues. To date, we have received 116 complaints of alleged abuse and have opened 25 investigations. Some complaints relate to terrorist diversions, but the majority, roughly 2/3, relate to theft and fraud schemes, such as collusion, product substitution, and false claims. For example, vendors paid bribes or kickbacks to implementer staff in exchange for competitive bidding data or manipulation of bid evaluations. One of our product substitution cases involved a Turkish vendor that placed more salt and less lentils in food kits to increase their profits. We also found non-food kits in a warehouse in Syria that were missing items or included substandard products such as poor quality frying pans that can easily be bent and folded, and tarps that were too small to shelter an adult. In one false claims case, a Jordanian NGO fabricated documentation that it distributed non-food items to communities in southern Syria, when in fact, the goods were distributed by another organization at its own expense. To date, we have made 7 referrals to USAID regarding 9 implementers. These referrals prompted USAID actions ranging from employee and program suspensions and terminations to now placing specific conditions on implementer awards and agreements. Our investigative outcomes have resulted in $11.5 million in savings and 6 programmatic suspensions of awards valued at $305 million. This represents about 1/3 of the money USAID dispersed in fiscal years 15 and 16. This demonstrates the impact our work has had and the proactive measures taken to further prevent losses. Our investigative cases not only stopped fraud, but also raised a number of concerns about implementer procurement practices and internal controls for managing projects, as well as USAID's oversight. First, we question whether implementers' procurement policies and internal controls are appropriate for the high-risk environment. In an effort to expedite procurements, implementers used an emergency waiver to bypass established procurement policies and procedures, including full and open competition. While the use of these waivers is allowable when the needs are urgent, they were used for an extended period of time and were not accompanied by enhanced monitoring. Internal control concerns relate to implementers' quality control procedures, such as allowing vendors to ship materials across the border without the items being inspected, and accepting substandard items. In addition, some implementers did not pursue allegations, overlooked evidence of wrongdoing, or did not notify USAID or OIG of internal investigations. Finally, our cases point to potential gaps in USAID oversight of implementers. For For example, OFTA generally did not require implementers to obtain prior agency approval of large subcontracts or set requirements to inspect them. Further, DART teams responsible for coordinating and managing response efforts did not include permanent subject matter experts to evaluate procured items. While we are encouraged by the steps USAID has taken and plans to take in response to the vulnerabilities we identified, continued vigilance and a better understanding of program deficiencies is required. To that end, my office, along with our partners at DoD and state, remain committed to aggressively cracking down on fraud, waste, and abuse. Concurrently, my office plans to advance audit work aimed at identifying systemic weaknesses and additional actions USAID can take to eliminate vulnerabilities before they can be further exploited. Providing aid in conflict settings presents significant challenges and frequently calls for flexible practices. However, as our investigators demonstrate and the work, flexibility cannot eclipse rigor. Madam Chairman, Ranking Member Deutsch, this concludes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really, thank you both for your testimony. There's certainly a lot to think about there, and I want to make sure that we thank you both and your teams for all the work they've done on this issue, for continuing to seek ways to help our agencies improve our oversight and the implementation of our assistance program. And Dr. Melito, I'll start some questions with you, if I might. Tell us about why it's important for individuals and organizations operating in Syria to conduct a risk assessment. And if you could tell us how the UN internal control framework compares to ours. How do the requirements differ?
Very good. A risk assessment is a jargony phrase of what is pretty obvious. It's management basically trying to understand the challenges that their employees are having in the field. In this case, it's generally a procurement and logistics exercise where they need to understand which particular players they're using for buying things, storing things, moving things. And in an environment of Syria, there's a lot of complicating factors and a lot of heavy risks. So a risk assessment would really be a diagnostic on looking at what exactly is the situation on the ground, what are they facing, and then recognizing that some of this is very risky, and then mitigating that by trying to make sure that there are oversight controls and just a good situational awareness on the part of management. That's why risk assessments are essential. In terms of the internal control framework of the UN, it is very similar. They're using international auditing standards, which are mirror in a lot of ways the ones that the US government uses. So when we have dialogues with them, we're pretty much on the same page. They are required to do risk assessments like the US government is. So there was no mismatch in discussions with them. They have the same requirements in that area.
Well, thank you. And all programs and just about anything we do are going to have at least some loss as a result of waste, fraud, abuse, diversion. It's sad to say, but it's reality-based. Did either state or USAID provide you with a number on how much they believe is being lost to waste, fraud, abuse, or diversion? And do you get a sense from the agencies that they expect a certain amount to be lost as the cost of doing business, and that they may have a formal or informal percentage they believe is acceptable?
So GEO's perspective on this, and this is the auditing community as well, is that you need reasonable assurance. Now, reasonable assurance is something which has to be sort of understood at the corporate level, and they need to really think about where their particular tolerance is. But we're not talking about absolute assurance. So I just want to drive that home, because absolute assurance would be too expensive, and it probably would prevent the humanitarian mission from going forward. In terms of the magnitude of the losses, I do not think USAID or state have really any inkling on that. I don't think they've done the work to address that, nor have they thought about what is their risk tolerance. So I think that's a dialogue that they need to have moving forward.
Thank you. And Inspector General, I know you can't really go into details about the individuals and the entities, because in a lot of these cases we're discussing ongoing investigations. But I did want to ask you a few questions about how that works when USAID says, okay, this implementing partner or this program is problematic, we need to cut ties. Because the vast majority of our assistance to for Syria, for the humanitarian crisis, does go through the UN, Obviously, there will be some overlap on implementing partners and partner organizations. So when USAID suspends these individuals, these entities, these programs, they're no longer eligible to receive any U.S. government awards, correct?
For a period of time.
And do we share this information with the UN or other organizations and implementing partners? And if so, what actions do they take, or what actions do we expect them to take?
Let me make a few comments with regard to your question. First of all, I'm very proud of the work that our Office of Special Agents and Investigations have done in this crisis. When the Overseas Contingency Operation was activated in 2014, proactive efforts went into the region, identified all of the implementers that were in that region, conducted 32 fraud awareness briefings with, over 400 individuals, including USAID, DART teams, implementers, public international organizations. From that, these allegations have come forward. We opened cases, and we found fraud. USAID's response to that has been very, very promising. And what I will say to that is that we have ongoing communications with the various bureaus affected by this, whether it be AFTA, whether it be Food for Peace, regarding what we found. And they have taken actions in terms of suspensions, debarments, special conditions put on awards, employee terminations, and they've done so oftentimes without having a full record of our investigation. And just to make a point of that, it's very difficult to sit down with organizations or with employees and say you're being suspended or you're being terminated without the full underpinnings of an investigation. So this speaks to what USAID proper has done in response to that, and they've taken approximately 35 actions as a result of our work. With regard to the UN, what happens is, and as you noted in your statement, so much of the money flows through UN organizations, these PIOs, as we refer to them. It's absolutely important because we do not have independent oversight of those operations. That information is shared. Our Office of Investigations put together, and I know you asked me about this when we met the other day, and I'm proud of it, so if I may hold it up for all of you, a fraud prevention and compliance handbook just for the region that goes out to everyone. This includes our UN counterparts. It includes all of the NGOs. It tells them what to look for. Our Syria Investigations Work Group, which we stood up, is a venue to actually brief the UN, our UN partners with its the World Food Program on the fraud we're seeing. We share vendors lists where we've had issues, and we put, I would say, not only them on notice, but pressure to say, you're likely working with the same implementers, now here, have at it. So you get the pressure points applied from a number of different perspectives, and I just wanted to take that moment because I'm very, very proud.
I'm glad that you did, because I can foresee an instance where maybe these guys are defrauding the UN or other implementing partners as well, or perhaps even the UN continues to work with them after we provide these agencies with our information. And just to finish up with the UN, perhaps I'll ask this of both of you, how does working through the UN impact our ability to exercise the kind of oversight that we would require if we were working with implementing partners directly in terms of things like transparency and accountability? How does that change?
So we do have audit authority over implementing partners. We do not have audit authority over the UN. That said, so there we go. I said we do have audit authority over implementing partners, but we do not have audit authority over UN agencies. That said, I've done, over the last 10 years, a series of reports involving UN agencies where I have generally gotten excellent cooperation. And I think that's in recognition of how important the U.S. is as a donor. And I think they want to cooperate with the U.S. government. So I can't point at a case where I wasn't ultimately able to get the information that GAO needed to do its work. So while it's an indirect process, ultimately I think it's been a successful process.
I would just add to that again to underscore our Syria Investigations Working Group. We also have reached out sort of on a one-on-one basis. I just recently met with the World Food Program Inspector General. I know that he was in town working with folks in the Bureau as well, and the pressure is really being applied, saying, you're going to be working with these same implementers, with these same vendors. We're relying on you to provide this aid. And I think it's also important to point out the very important role that the UN plays. They provide these bulk items in terms of humanitarian assistance into the region. They can have staff in Syria. You know, we need them. They provide a huge role and help us achieve this mission. We just need to stay on top of them, make sure that the right oversight, the monitoring, the internal controls are established, and that USAID puts some pressure on them to do it. I will tell you, you can be assured we'll be on it.
I understand that. Congratulations to both of you for the great work that you do. It's important to carry that message to the U.S. taxpayer. Thank you. And with that, my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I also want to express my personal gratitude and our subcommittee's gratitude for the work that you've done here. I think it's really important. I want, Ms. Barr, I'd like to just pick up where the chairman left off on what happens when there is a suspension for fraud activities. I tell my friend, if you'd like to wait, I'll sit in as chair. It's not something I get to do. I'm just kidding. So I just
Will the gentleman yield the rest of his time?
if I get to be chairman, I will. When there is a program that's suspended, there is a quick move. How quickly can we move to find a partner to pick up whatever support that program was providing, and how do we ensure that for all of the really necessary oversight efforts that you've both been so deeply engaged in, that we don't wind up with serious gaps in providing the life-saving services that are so important?
I can tell you that USAID works very, very promptly to try to identify other implementers that the aid, so that the aid can resume to get to those in need. And they work very heartily and swiftly at that. There sometimes is a delay. I'm not going to say there isn't a gap in that aid going out, because it certainly does happen. But these companies needed to be suspended. As our results show, you know, we have 6 suspensions currently out in place, and those are 6 program suspensions that fall under some major implementers. The best thing that we can do, and I think it's in line with Tom's statement and the work of GAO overall, USAID's role is really to establish a baseline set of internal controls, procurement practices that they're going to require for any implementer, regardless of who they are. You know how many are out there. The range of the rigor in their controls is going to be vast. There should be a baseline standard set for what those internal controls should be, what those good procurement practices should be, and those should be monitored from USAID. And given that we don't have the oversight authority with the UN, you know, establishing those expectations, setting them, making that a condition of the money flowing to those in need it sounds quite simple, but it hasn't been uniformly applied. And I think it speaks to the recommendations that the GAO report makes, and certainly to the observations that are coming out of the outcomes we found.
I appreciate that. It's a really good suggestion. Dr. Melito, I wanted to acknowledge, I think, what we've all already been discussing, that in a conflict zone like Syria, we can't have U.S. personnel on the ground. So we rely on remote monitoring and management. The report discusses many of the challenges of remote management, but if you could just elaborate on these challenges, and in this particular environment, why it's different in terms of what agencies and implementers have dealt with previously. Why is this such a concern for oversight in particular?
So, as you mentioned, U.S. government officials cannot enter Syria. So, for a normal humanitarian assistance effort, you would expect on-the-ground monitoring by U.S. government officials. They would be looking at the warehouses. They would be watching the beneficiaries receive their assistance, making sure it's up to the quality and quantity that we paid for. In this case, the information they have to rely on is coming from people who are inside the country, telling them subsequently what has happened. That's indirect. Now, they trust a number of these parties correctly, but it is still, though, something which is indirect for them. So what they do, they end up trying to triangulate, try to get information from multiple sources. They're trying to use some new technologies, also geotagging pictures of things, and that's all very good, but it'll never be as effective as being able to see it yourself. So that in itself means the risk of fraud and diversion is greater. Because of the indirectness of the monitoring, you are in a situation and environment which heightens the risks, and that needs to be recognized and addressed.
And can you, just in the remaining time that I have, can you try to put a face on this? When we're obviously concerned, we're grateful for the report, and we're concerned about instances of bribery and bid rigging and failure to provide the material that have been committed to or contracted to provide. But what does that actually mean for the people who were to have been on the receiving end? I mean, we know what the impact is on our taxpayers, and that's why this is so important. But just how awful is it to the people on the ground who are in such desperate need?
So in your statement, in the chairman's statement, you talked about the magnitude of it, 13.5 million people inside the country. The U.S. government estimates it's reaching about 4 million. So that is, U.S. government is doing great as the single largest donor, but it's only reaching a subset. Any diversion from that is even lower than that. So from our perspective, this is literally taking food out of the mouths of babies. I mean, it is taking resources that are in desperate need and not putting it where it needs to be, and instead in hands of people who you are not designated as the target. So it has a direct humanitarian impact. It's not just that this is a bad deed that we don't want to happen for criminal reasons. It's hurting the humanitarian mission, and that needs to be kept front and center.
I appreciate that, and just Ms. Bartow, I'd say to you, as grateful as we are for the focus on the impact, dollars are one thing, and they're important, and as watchdogs, it's important that you focus on that. But the work that you do is so terribly important, because the proposals that you made, if they are followed, will mean not only that taxpayers can be satisfied that their tax dollars are being used the way they're supposed to, but that those tax dollars are actually being used to save lives, and we're grateful for that. I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. DeSantis, if you're ready, if you're in a hurry, I'll yield to you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses. So obviously, we appreciate you looking into this. We know there's going to be a certain amount of waste, fraud, and abuse, unfortunately, when you have operations going on in this area. But did you get the approximate numbers on how much U.S. assistance inside Syria may have been lost due to waste or fraud?
GAO does not have a number. That would be the kind of number that AID would need to produce itself. I defer to my colleague if she has any information.
What I can tell you is what we reported and what we know is $1.3 million in losses, and those would be losses that are due to fires, bombings, parachutes not opening when pallets drop, but they also refer to diversions to other terrorist organizations.
What about fraud?
And with regard to fraud, sometimes things, they're stolen, but in terms of fraud, it's hard to quantify the total dollar.
I think you have to view it differently. I mean, if you're in a hot zone and you have aid that's intercepted by terrorists, that's much different than if the money is just being frittered away. And so I think it's important for us to know the distinctions on there. Let me ask you this, Mr. Melito. There have been a number of attacks on medical facilities and humanitarian workers in Syria. Did either USAID or state provide a list of all instances in which one of the belligerents in Syria attacked any of our partners delivering aid or seized any of our assistance?
So in our report, we talk about some UN information on that. So UN reports about 89 humanitarian workers have been killed since the conflict has started, and there have been hundreds of attacks on medical facilities and also attacks on food deliveries and such. And in the U.S., in our report, we also talk about when the city of Palmyra fell, food that was stored there fell into the hands of ISIS.
So do you have an estimate on the numbers and the costs in terms of the assistance that has been implicated by any of those? I guess state didn't give you any information?
We are unaware of either agency doing a comprehensive assessment of that.
Okay. There are UN Security Council resolutions in place for access and movement for humanitarian assistance inside Syria, but from your report, it seems that Assad's regime may be in violation of these resolutions. So how many requests do you know has the regime denied since the beginning of 2015?
The UN is reporting that they're only receiving approvals about 10% of the time. I think the number that we report is 110 requests and 13 approvals. So, and what's going on there? It pays to talk a little bit about it. So when the UN wishes to go outside of the Assad-controlled areas to the areas outside of that control, they need permission for what the items are. They need permission to travel on the roads. They need permission to cross checkpoints. They need visas for employees to come in. And they have not been getting the approvals 90% of the time. And when they do get it, they said it's very slow and uncertain.
So it's even if they're not actually denying it, they're basically undermining it with the process. And so how has state and USAID responded to those limitations?
Well, the U.S. has been part of the international community's effort to broaden the delivery of services. So there was two Security Council resolutions that passed in 14 and 15, which made it legal for delivery of services cross-border. And that's what most of the international NGOs are doing. They're delivering assistance from Turkey and Jordan mostly, and that's against the wishes of the regime. So they're the case. They're saying that the humanitarian assistance is more important than the wishes of the regime. This that we're referring to as denials is areas that are still within the control of the regime or at the border of the control of the regime. So it's two different ways of delivering services.
The agencies have concurred with your recommendations. How long do they have to implement these and for you to close the recommendations?
GAO tracks its recommendations for 4 years, but generally agencies respond within 1 or 2 years, and given the importance of this issue, I'm hopeful they'll do it quickly.
Great. Well, I thank you, thank the witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I want to start by saying that I think most of us agree that what's going on in Syria is one of the greatest humanitarian tragedies of our lifetime, at least since World War II. And there's no question that we have to do whatever is reasonably possible to be part of efforts to relieve some of this suffering, the starvation, the homelessness, and because we're going to lose a generation of people, of young people who are not getting health care or getting education. So I want to say that I appreciate your efforts to try to make sure that it's done right. My first question is, in your review of the programs, can you tell us, are any programs doing better than others, and what is it that, where things are working, what makes it different?
I think it goes back to what we said in terms of what's missing. And what's missing is when there aren't clear expectations regarding what should be internal control processes and good procurement practices that need to be in place given the fact that you're in these highly unstable environments, the fact that it is remote monitoring and remote oversight. Those kinds of things call for special conditions. And I think it's incumbent upon USAID, it all starts with them, setting those baselines of standards, holding its implementers, NGOs to that standards, the UN organizations to that standard, and make sure that the reporting does come back. There has to be that basic minimum set of circumstances and requirements put in place, and currently that's missing.
In your review, were you able to determine where aid is actually getting through to? Because I know you have regime-held areas and you have ISIL-held areas, and then you have, I guess, other areas.
So the U.S. agencies, both state and AID, pay very close attention to the map, basically. And it divides up generally into areas that are controlled by the Assad regime and the areas right near that, which includes a lot of besieged areas and hard-to-reach areas. And the other part is the areas near the borders of Turkey and Jordan. They have different implementing partners for those two. So the UN is able to operate within the Assad-controlled areas of the country. The international NGOs cannot operate there, but they can operate cross-border. And in all those cases, state and EID pay very close attention to groups which are not permitted to receive assistance. And we've got quite a very good assurance that there is no assistance going currently to ISIS-controlled areas. That all said, it's a very fluid situation on the ground and a very complicated situation on the ground that has to be constantly monitored. But those are the kinds of things that the agencies are balancing.
So is aid going to the Assad-controlled areas?
Yes. The UN there are a number of individuals in the Assad-controlled areas which are in desperate need. So the UN is providing assistance there, but it also is deploying out of those areas into the besieged and hard-to-reach areas. That said, it's not reaching nearly as many of those people as it wishes to. That's the reference to being denied access by the regime.
So Assad is denied. And which countries are being used, which borders to get the assistance across? Which are the
it's predominantly Turkey in the north and Jordan in the south. Those are the two main.
And how cooperative have their governments been and their military that's on the border?
That's probably appropriate for state and AID, but my understanding is they have been getting good cooperation.
That they have been giving good cooperation. All right. I have nothing further. Thank you. I yield back.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry, Dr. Melito, did you just say that the Turkey and the Jordan military have not been very cooperative? They have been cooperative. Okay. I don't think your button's on, but
Yes, have been, sorry.
have been, okay.
I want to be clear on that.
All right, very good. A lot of questions. Is it Calvaresi Bar? Calvaresi Bar?
Calvaresi Bar.
Calvaresi
Yeah.
Bar. Okay,
Very good.
I can do this. You said earlier, I think, that there were 9 partners that had been either used or identified as bad players. Refresh my memory on that.
We have 7 referrals that we've given to USAID, and they involve 9 implementers. Implementers, right.
Okay.
So, and the program suspensions that we have in place are 6. And I, again, just want to underscore, this isn't a wholesale suspension of the implementer writ large. These are programs within these implementer.
And what period of time? Is that the last year?
This is data pretty much coming from 14 through the present.
So the last, not quite 2.
Since the overseas contingency operation.
I got you. And when aid is delivered, you have evidence that it was delivered?
So I think part of the challenge definitely lies in that, and I think we're calling for recommendations along the lines of the types of reporting back you might require under some of these basic standards that you set. Could it be a phone call? Could it be a printed receipt? Are there ways to put more branding or tags or labeling on the food, on the non-food items to come back? But because we're in this kind of remote business and we're reliant on others, we have to come up with creative mechanisms to determine that, in fact, that aid did reach those it was intended for. Currently, again, that's a mixed bag, but I think if there are reporting standards and other kind of baselines established, it could help.
Well, they can put chips in animals, right, that can be tracked. So if you put one on just every 50th, item or so?
Yeah.
Has that been looked at?
It is something that I think is under consideration, talking about a whole range of options. But it all starts with even checking at the warehouses before it crosses the border, whether it be in Turkey and Jordan. It starts there, and then what happens in transit. Because again, this is remote monitoring. Yeah. This is remote oversight.
So if you lose an implementer, do you have a ready supply of people lined up on a list that are applying to be implementers?
I represent the Oversight communities, so not being USAID proper, OFTA, or others, to know exactly what their full list of contingents are. I know that for the aid going into Syria, they're working with approximately 29 implementers now. But oftentimes when these situations occur, folks go into the region very, very quickly in order to deliver the aid, to deliver the assistance, and that, you know, that creates some vulnerabilities in and of itself. They're new to it. We're relying on them. It creates a perfect storm for what our investigations have found.
Makes me wonder if there's not a preferred implementer that actually, this is probably not the right term, but gets a kickback or a favorite, and they get a pass, they get to come on deep into Syria with the least amount of hassle. Has that been your findings or no? Are there preferred implementers? One does a better job than the other?
You know, hard to say if they're a preferred, but I can tell you that all of the implementers have to show themselves as presently responsible. And when that doesn't occur, and there's certain criteria for that, that's when program suspensions and other things happen. So there's some implementers out there that have very, very good, as I said in the beginning, tight controls, good internal, know what internal controls are brought into.
They all get treated. I guess I'm asking, are they bipartisan? Is what I'm asking. They all get treated the same.
They all get treated the same.
Okay, good. And has there ever been an instance where there's a recovery of any aid? Aid gets lost, gets taken, and once that happens, it's done.
Our work, one of the impacts that we talked about is the fact that we brought in $11.5 million in savings as a result of our fraud investigations. And what that means is when we uncovered the fact, like in the case of a Jordanian NGO that was to provide assistance, and had another NGO actually do the transport and deliver the items, but yet charged USAID for it when it was incurred by another NGO, shut down that program, shut down that operation. That one in and of itself was 10.5 of the 11.5 million.
Are there criminal charges that ensue in that instance?
In some cases, these are ongoing investigations. There could be criminal implications as a result of it, but I can tell you resulted in a number of employee and implementer terminations, suspensions, debarments.
Okay, and then Dr. Melito, I think you said some aid workers were killed, and I didn't quite hear what you said. Did you say 8 or 9 or 89?
According to the UN, 89 humanitarian.
89.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And then furthermore, Turkey and Jordan were the two areas that the aid came out of, but did you say that they really didn't, that the Assad regime really doesn't prefer that?
So until these Security Council resolutions were passed, it wasn't clear that they could do that because it would be violating the sovereignty of the country. Normally, you have to basically get the permission of the country to provide assistance. Yes, the Assad regime is not supporting the cross-border assistance, and they're doing it against his wishes, but it is it is legal now because of Security Council resolutions.
So is it because Turkey and Jordan signed on to the resolution of some?
The Security Council resolutions have the force of law internationally, so they gave permission for that kind of assistance to occur.
So would Assad rather they come from Russia, from Iran, from Iraq? Where would he rather them they come?
He'd rather it was in his areas of control.
His area of self-control, so he can parlay out the
He can determine
goods
when and
as-
how, yes.
how he wants to. Well, that makes sense, I guess, if you're Assad. Okay, and then finally, your office hasn't yet conducted audits of USAID and programs in Syria. Is that right?
We, in fact, have done some audits in the recent past. There were about 3 audits that were done in the 2014 timeframe. They were, with that said, there were very specific audits looking like a survey of OFTA activities. There were audits regarding Office of Transition initiatives work there, Food for Peace work. One thing, if I could take a moment, just since I've been sworn in into this position as the new IG at USAID, one thing that we need to do better, and I'm working very quickly to do so, is to make sure that our work informs at the policy and the strategic level and goes over after the highest risk areas. We've done tremendous work on Food for Peace programs over the years. They're very, very program transactional specific, but it doesn't raise oftentimes to the higher level. As a result of our investigative work, a number of program concerns and questions have been raised now regarding internal controls, procurement practices. We are now focusing our audit work and our audit plans going forward on those very real effects that our Office of Investigations have found. So we have some work to do in that area, and I don't want to belittle what USAID IG has done before, but we need to link it to those policy level decisions in the bigger picture and the highest risk and cross-cutting work across the board, and I'm committed to do that.
Well, that's encouraging to hear. So you'll have a plan put together, and we'll see you back next week?
Can I have an extra week on top of that?
All right. Well, my time has expired. I'm going to yield back. Ted, any more questions? All right. This hearing is concluded. Thank you very much.